Our next session is a panel discussion, as you can see, and I'm pleased to invite Stephen, Nolan and Luciana to the stage, please.
Morning, thank you. So my name is Steve Beale, so I'm the Chief Executive of Freeport East, which is the Freeport on the coast of East Anglia. So it covers the ports of Harwich, Felixstowe and Ipswich. I've been in post for a couple of years now. Like many of my colleagues actually running Freeports, I have a background in both the public and private sector, which I think kind of reflects the fact that ultimately all the Freeports are public-private partnerships. I have my background is generally then around infrastructure, economic development, a long time working in the energy sector, which is all very relevant to Freeports as well, and also working overseas for the British government as a diplomat. Excellent.
Hi all, it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Luciana Ciabattari, I'm the CEO of Celtic Freeport. We are the organisation that represents the Freeport in South Wales. One of our ports is the ABP Port Talbot, and the other one is the Pembrokeshire and the Freeport Port Authority. And we also have different players around energy that join our proposition. My background is also in public-private sectors, but mainly focused on foreign direct investment, having worked in other Freeports before, but also in the British government and in the banking industry.
Nolan Gray, I'm a strategic director with Akins Realis, and I have had the privilege of delivering the first and largest Freeport at Teesside very recently.
Thank you all. I think it would be good to start with getting everyone on the same page. We've heard a lot from the previous government in the UK about the reasons for getting the Freeport system going. But as I understand it, you've all got a different proposition to bring to the table or to the market. So Nolan, could you just get us going and describe the common themes that you're seeing in Freeport's policy?
So the UK Freeport policy was quite a well thought through document because it looked to address some of the problems with international Freeports, but also looking at the problems that we have in a lot of our coastal communities or around our ports particularly. So they're built off three main principles: to regenerate that area and create new jobs, to be hubs for inward investment, and also to drive innovation in those areas. And they do that through a couple of mechanisms. One is by the establishment of some tax zones with tax incentives. Up to about 600 hectares of land can be accommodated in each location. And then also to bring in a customs zone, which means that you can have businesses utilising customs efficiencies around about 45 kilometres from the central customs zone that normally is located behind one of the major ports. One of the key elements of the Freeports is they are UK landed. So what does that mean? They sit in the UK territory, they're in our border. That means all of the laws that apply to any other part of the UK apply within a Freeport, with the exception of some tax incentives or some customs reliefs, which are subject to various stringent levels of governance.
That's really helpful. I noticed that there's been quite some strong rhetoric coming out of the Levelling Up department of the government, which is suggesting that green energy and infrastructure is tied into traditional shipping and port cargo work. So could I turn to you, Luciana? Could you tell us a little bit about the setting of Celtic Freeport and how that interaction with the local environment and the region and the community, how is that working?
Thank you. So I think it's quite interesting in Wales, the configuration of our ports. Milford Haven, that side of the region, is 20% of all the oil and gas consumption of the UK, production and consumption in the UK. So it's still very traditional energy port with one of the main emitters in Wales based in that particular region. So we have a big challenge there to both decarbonise the industry we have there, but also move forward into renewable energy. The main potential for us is around floating offshore wind, but also other renewables like sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen, methanol, ammonia. So there's like a lot we can do in that region, but we need port infrastructure to allow that to move forward. And in terms of the community engagement that you mentioned and the benefit for the community, our energy port is currently employing over 8,000 people in that community. So what are the challenges of decarbonization in terms of securing those employments, in terms of making sure that some communities that traditionally are around ports, not just in Wales, are very deprived. There's like a big issue of skills and upskilling in terms of the low carbon industry. So how can the Freeport bring in the right investors, the right innovators along this transition in a way that is fair and just to the local communities, working together with the councils, working together with the regulators, and making sure we are giving back to the community in a way that is going to really unlock sustainable jobs in the future, and make sure we have a robust economy there.
That's really interesting to hear, and I think it's so important that ports are making that connection with the societies and the communities around and beyond their gate. That's something that has been neglected for a number of decades. Steve, what's your experience on the east side of the country? You're in a slightly different perspective there, population-wise, and with a different industrial heritage. So how has your port come at this issue?
Well, I mean, just maybe to add briefly to what Nolan was saying, I think a lot of public policy these days recognises that you really need to focus on places to make public policy effective. And to be honest, I think this is the first time, frankly, in decades, and this goes back across many kind of different governments, that there has been a kind of spatially focused attempt to get the benefits out of what ports can kind of create for the economy and local communities. We've known for forever actually that as a trading nation that our ports and international gateways create lots of economic growth, but we've not necessarily made the attempt to capture that locally. And I think that's what we now have, a set of mechanisms that Nolan's described that allow us to do that. In our area, so we don't have the kind of, in a sense, fossil fuel heritage that some other parts of the UK have in particular. But the East Anglian coast has the largest kind of European offshore wind portfolio currently in existence. There is actually a lot of nuclear in our area. We have a kind of heavily actually agricultural hinterland. But so one of the kind of the big focuses that we've already made is around the development of green hydrogen, which is not a panacea by any means, but I think it's part of a future kind of energy mix. We've also focused an awful lot on transport decarbonisation and what's going to drive that. Our three ports, one is Felixstowe, which is the UK's biggest container port, and there's something like 50,000 trucks a day going in and out of Felixstowe port. That's an enormous challenge in terms of getting to net zero, so that's a particular kind of focus that we've worked on. We've already kind of signed a partnership with East Midlands Freeport actually for a green freight corridor between us, which is a mixture of, let's say, modal shift. So actually the first priority is actually to get on the railways, but actually for all of that transport that's still going to be on the roads, how do we push for zero emission vehicles? How do we do other things that support kind of communities deal with what will always be a kind of heavy traffic flow?
Yeah, you've mentioned so much in that response, including the number of ports in your area, the supply chain and the connectivity. I've always seen the maritime sector as working traditionally in silos, and I'm detecting we're seeing much more collaboration, which must be an essential requirement of the Green Corridor Initiative, for example. I wondered, Nolan, whether you could perhaps touch on what you're seeing in terms of that collaboration across freeports, both within the ports that sit within them and externally with other freeports. Is that something that's changing and you're seeing change?
Well, I think it goes back to the initial concept of the policy was that freeports should not work in isolation. So from the outset, and you've got to bear in mind this policy is still relatively infant. It's still growing, it's still learning. But at the very start, all of the original 8 English freeports came together. We had a regular meeting every 2 weeks, roughly, all through that setup phase. And then as the 2 new Scottish freeports were announced, they were included. And although I've left that cohort now, I'm assuming that the Welsh freeports are included, which meant there was already this collaboration going on behind the scenes. It wasn't an anti-competitive collaboration, it was about how do you deliver the Freeport first, how do you maximise the benefit first, and then indeed, can you then increase the connectivity? Because although the Freeport locations are geographically dispersed, the businesses that trade within those port environments tend to have footprints across the country and indeed across the globe. So by being able to work together, you actually get a greater level of benefit, a greater level of cross-collaboration.
Are there any particular industry sectors that you see as being ripe for opportunities for growth in view of the location of the Freeports and this new era of collaboration? Can you each talk about one example?
Certainly from a northeast perspective, the automotive trade is something that is heavily looked at because there are already existing businesses that operate from customs affiliated sites. So they almost are operating like pseudo Freeports now.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the ability for them to build cars in the UK that are actually technically duty free as they're built, and then as they're delivered into the UK market, you pay the duty. They're delivered in the UK market. But if they are exported, they pay the relevant dues and duties as they're leaving. So the ability to have that entire system delivered out of various locations, the likes of Liverpool have an automotive cluster, Thames with Ford, and some around the East Midlands as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Luciana, I guess that's different for you in the Southwest.
It is a little bit different, but again, I think there are industries that we cover that are very important across the UK, and we could collaborate. So I mentioned a little bit about energy, and that's one that is clear that we can collaborate. We are all across England, Wales, and Scotland, and Northern Ireland facing challenges in decarbonization of our industries and the move towards renewable energy, but we don't have necessarily the capacity or the landscape to create offshore wind or onshore wind or solar or hydrogen in many different configurations. So how can we collaborate between the Freeports to make sure we are maximizing our strengths in renewable energy and creating together policies for grid capacity, for the pipelines, or how we're going to transport those different fuels. And again, it comes to the point that we are an island as a nation, as 4 nations, and we need also to make sure that the shipping industry and their transition into renewable fuels, where they're going to go and where those ships are going to be refueled, and how we can ensure that among all of us, we are connected in terms of collective infrastructure for the particular area of energy transition. The other bit of the Freeport, that is in Port Talbot, is very strong in steel, for example. And for me, the main example of the transition there is with the transition from the virgin coal-based steel into electric arc furnaces, we will be much more focused on scraps. And the UK currently is one of the largest world producers of scrap metal that is actually exported. And what we will need now is to make sure we have an internal domestic logistics to bring those scraps into Wales, for example, to be repurposed into new steel.
Yeah.
So how among ourselves we can have the different ports across the UK that are exporting scraps, make this logistics as a domestic opportunity to bring that to Wales and then move it around. So I think there are some opportunities both in steel manufacturing and energy that we all could be working together, even though they're very particular for Wales.
I think Wales, it sounds as though you're perfectly set up to generate and take advantage of those kind of circular economy principles in that sector that we read about and don't see that many real world examples. Steve, what about you? You're so close to the offshore wind sector and other energy sources. Is this a sector you see huge growth?
Yeah, well, so in terms of your point about collaboration, I mean, certainly actually also on hydrogen, so between us and the Thames Estuary, there's a lot of collaboration. I think real opportunities there in terms of the southeast of the UK. We've got very large container ports and very large kind of decarbonisation needs. Offshore wind, and I think, this is a case where there's a lot of talk about kind of inter-port competition in the UK. Ultimately, some of these sectors are about our competition in relation to other countries. And I think particularly in the offshore wind sector, there is a well kind of versed enormous need for new offshore wind port capacity in the UK. It acts as a significant bottleneck. In practice it has done for 15 years or so. It's never really been properly addressed, but I think it's becoming kind of more and more obvious now. We have a proposal for a close to £500 million kind of new port investment in Harwich, which is designed to support the offshore wind sector. In my mind, it's definitely not about just competition between different ports in the UK. It's about, are we competing with Cuxhaven and Esbjerg and other places in Europe? Because if we don't provide that capacity, a lot of the opportunities of our UK users, wind farms, would actually go to Europe instead. And I mean, good luck to the Europeans for that, but I think that's, really we need to be kind of making sure that we capture the local benefits, local economic benefits of those wind farms, and it really does come down to investing in ports.
It's amazing that you each have described a unique proposition. But what I want to turn our attention to now is around the topic of innovation. When I've travelled for work, I've seen some quite unique hubs of innovation in ports. For example, near the cruise terminal at Porto, you've got a 6-story building with marine biologists, divers and drones flying around who've obviously been given an incentive to look into R&D. I've seen similar in Halifax in Canada, Rotterdam, Amsterdam. Are the free ports supporting and able to catalyse real innovation that will create local jobs and attract people from the supply chain into your localities? Are you seeing that change, Nolan?
Yeah. So when we established Teesside Freeport, one of the things we recognised is coming out of the back of COVID, and when we saw lots of ships stacked at ports, one of the reasons they were stacked was very simply bills of lading or paper. And because people weren't allowed to interact, that piece of paper could not be handed over. So some of the actual delays we've seen in ports has not been about a change of law or a change of rule. It's actually about physical documentation. So one of the things we established through Teesside Freeport was the Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation, which is led by the International Chamber of Commerce. And it wasn't about Teesside Freeport, that was about a centre that is open to all, and particularly the free ports and the customs benefits that free ports offer. And through that centre, it established a base at Teesside University, a number of people employed there, but we started running pilot schemes. And so we ran, for example, tea through Mombasa into PD ports at Teesside and onto Yorkshire tea. It transacted the normal approach with all the paper-based systems, but behind the scenes there was an ecosystem of trust built up, and it was all done digitally. Since then, there's been trials of various other commodities through some of the other free port areas as well. The idea being that if we can move everything to this digital framework, it will save us all time. And we've seen what problems occur when time is wasted in ports.
Yeah, that's critical to retailers and freight forwarders, and that's something that does.
Even people going on their summer holidays, let's be honest. No one wants to sit in a 15-hour queue.
Luciana, on innovation, what are you seeing? What can Celtic Port offer? Is there something unique that you think will generate jobs?
Yes, of course. So I think there are a couple of things to highlight there. One of them is that among all the free ports, we all have innovation at a core strategy, and we all have allocated funds to support the unlocking of innovation. In the Celtic context, I think Nolan mentioned a word that is very important for us, and that is having pilots and having tangible proof of concept so things can scale. So what we are offering already at the moment are some test and demonstrator facilities and funds, and I think it needs to be linked to the industry need. So there's a magic there that needs to happen among innovation that's coming out from universities or from really like entrepreneurs, with what the big players in the industry and the big financiers also want to see and invest on, and how do we help as a Freeport in Wales in particular to make that matchmaking. So there is not a lack of money available in my perception, and there is not a lack necessarily of projects that are innovative, and particularly around energy transition, green steel, construction infrastructure, digitization. The critical point now is how do we fund in the right stages things can become a pilot, can have a proof of concept and can scale, and how do we matchmake those? So I think from a Celtic perspective, what we are trying to do, apart from the test and demonstrator, is work together, for example, with Plug and Play, which is a venture capital firm and has lots of experience of developing those hubs, to understand how do we best matchmake the investment that is available with the innovation that we need connected to industries in pilot schemes.
And you're hoping to become an innovation centre for floating offshore wind as well?
Yes, but not only floating offshore wind, because again, I think it needs to be a matrix and a mix of energy. So we want to have opportunities at floating offshore wind, but also onshore wind, solar, hydrogen, and other fuels. One thing that I think we haven't mentioned yet, but it's quite interesting for the purpose of the conference, is marine and tidal energy as well, which I know some of the other free ports are also very good at. But that's one of the main ways in which we can ensure coastal protection, good jobs across the thing. And we do have, particularly in Wales, big tides and a big opportunity there. And for the first time we saw in the allocation round a big tidal project being approved. So how we create innovation on those technologies that sometimes we don't talk too much about. So that's one of the ways that Celtic Freeport wants to address it as well.
Great, thank you. Let's bring in Steve here from his perspective of the East.
Yep. So again, and I think to provide an example of what Freeports can do differently to any other kind of bodies in the UK, no one talks about kind of trade with countries in Africa actually effectively. We've talked about trade, not aid, for decades, and yet actually most of the developing world still find it incredibly difficult to trade with the UK. Actually, Freeports are the only bodies in the UK now that kind of bring together the partners that can actually make a change on that agenda. And I think that's a kind of real opportunity actually with government, that we can kind of push forward the opportunities, which are great for the UK and also great for the Global South. In terms of innovation in our local area, lots to talk about. We're already investing in a new innovation centre in Stowmarket, which is actually really around kind of green construction and green logistics. But Harwich is another place, actually really on the maritime side, that we're really focused on trying to build an innovation ecosystem. Harwich is a place that again has economically not been successful in recent decades, and has seen the decline of industries. We've got maritime heritage galore, going back to the Mayflower, the Kinder transport, shipping over kind of many centuries. And so we're trying to, from the ground up, build an innovation cluster there. Now that's partly about focusing on specific sectors around clean fuels and green hydrogen, for example, and offshore wind. But then really kind of targeting the opportunities to bring people in. So we did some work around kind of green hydrogen kind of innovation pilots that we kind of released publicly. We've engaged with industry, we've then built consortia to kind of seek grant funding, and kind of attracted about £5 million to support some of those pilots, benefiting local companies, but also actually I know kind of companies in the Solent and South Wales, etc. And then as one kind of example of what it does in practice, so there's a company called Rux Energy that are based in Sydney, Australia. They do extremely smart stuff with nanomaterials for hydrogen storage. They are now kind of coming to set themselves up in Harwich, which frankly would never have happened without the support of the Freeport. And working with them, you then kind of build that momentum to attract other people as well and other opportunities. So I think we're already beginning to see what it means to be place focused. That as the Freeports are, really try and support on the economic growth side of some of these kind of smaller locations. And I think it really fits within the kind of maritime agenda, because that's where there are such significant opportunities.
It's really exciting to hear this kind of build-up of momentum in some of these connections, and that's partly what we want the conference to address. So we're hearing real-world examples here, which I think is very useful. Now, in traditional BBC style, I need to address another topic, and that is post-Brexit. A number of detractors of free ports, for example, have questioned environmental regulations and that they might not be as strong now the UK has departed from the EU. And we hear a lot of stories about the deterioration of seabed quality, water quality, species, the quality of protected areas. Could you each tell me something about the latest thinking in Freeport around this environmental regulation piece? Because we've said to be truly blue, you have to be thinking green. So what are Freeports doing to take into account this potential interaction with environmental damage?
Well, I think I mentioned at the outset, Freeports exist within the UK territory. So the rules and regulations around the environment are exactly the same within a Freeport as without. But if anyone has ever gone through the process of engaging with the MMO to get permission to build a new quayside, they will know just how complex that process is. So typically you are looking at a process of up to about 12 months to get permission to sample. You then take a further 18 months of going through sampling and planning permissions, and for a quayside design you need an MMO permission to go below the water. You then need planning permission to build above the water and on land. And then you need things like Natural England or various counterparties in some of the other areas to sign off on that. So there's a very long process. So the Freeports themselves look at this and go, well, we need to make the best sense of what we've got.
Yeah.
We've got geography here on our side, we've got a place on our side. A Freeport doesn't work without all of the stakeholders coming together. So the reason the Freeports are where they are is because people do want them. They want to improve their areas, they want to regenerate the areas, they want to create jobs in these societies, because a lot of our coastal communities have been left behind. And part of that is about looking after what we've got.
Yeah.
And a lot of our Freeports, so if you look at Solent, if you look at Teesside, if you look at Humber, are right hard up against SSSI sites as well. So a lot of the Freeports are doing a lot of work where when there's an investment in a brownfield site for regeneration, they're actually then investing an awful lot of money on the SSSI sites to bring them up to a much higher standard, such that that offsets then rebuilding on the brownfield site.
I don't think people would appreciate that. That's good to hear that news. And Luciana, you're nodding there. Are you seeing a similar interaction in the Southwest?
Yeah, and I think actually to some extent the environmental regulations and the net zero accounting for the Freeports is sometimes even more strict than in other operating ecosystems in the UK. So just from like small perspectives, we as Freeports, generally speaking, we are a small organization. We are a consortia of lots of landowners who have land within the ports, and as the Freeport organization, even though we don't own the land, we are co-responsible for making sure that all the landowners have their environmental impact assessment. There is like monitoring evaluation agreement with both Welsh government, in my case, and UK government, that we need to report on net zero carbon emissions, plans for the future. In terms of Wales in particular, there's also the Future Generations Act, which we are also, it's legally binding to all companies and the Freeport operating in Wales. So it's quite strict, and as Nolan said, we need to work with all the regulators. We need sometimes to make sure our landowners are compliant as well, and if they're not compliant, we have mechanisms that also ensure that some of the benefits and the tax incentives are not released. So I think in a way there is also the will of the community to have us there. There is the will of the businesses to have us there, but we also are all into an understanding that some of the incentives and mechanisms will only be released if we are following very properly the rules to a very strict standard.
Sure, good to hear. And Steve?
Yeah, I mean,
do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and it can be hard sometimes to respond to kind of, in a sense, allegations that are based on no credible reading of the policy or the reality of actually what's going on. But that's the kind of way things often work these days. In my local area, my board includes representatives of the Green Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party. My local councils and kind of communities have demonstrated very clearly through the ballot box their commitment to sustainability, green credentials, etc., etc. So it's deeply embedded in everything that we're trying to do to kind of absolutely support the most positive kind of sustainability agenda we possibly can. Examples of that, we've been doing work with local landowners actually in terms of how they can benefit from natural capital markets, which is all about kind of increasing biodiversity locally. Our Green Corridor work with East Midlands includes a strand which is looking at how can we incorporate biodiversity into some of our kind of green transport corridors. we have had kind of conversations about trying to explore what we can do to help on the marine side, where the southern North Sea has suffered for decades actually in terms of its kind of marine ecology side, and that's a real challenge. But I think that's all part of kind of what we're looking at. And then where we do have kind of major developments, so the Bathside Bay development, which includes a kind of large scale reclamation of kind of low-lying coastal waters, there's something like 166% biodiversity net gain planned for a kind of another site along the coast to make sure that we replicate what we've got in terms of biodiversity. So I genuinely think it's very, very close to the top of our agenda. Also, a lot of the stuff that we're doing on the clean energy side is also kind of focused on this type of agenda. So
it's a real positive.
It kind of reassures people, but it's really important to us.
Yeah, some really valuable anchors in some of the initiatives that are underway. Look, we need to wrap up. I'm afraid we're kind of running out of time. I would like to ask you each for a soundbite to finish with, and I want to ask the question: how far can Freeports go? Where do you see the Freeports status in 5 to 10 years? Could you sum up in one or two sentences where you see the future, Steve, for Eastport?
So I've actually been engaging with people that are involved in COP29 about the role of green zones and green corridors. I genuinely think that if the government provides support that I think the policy justifies, then we could be looking in 5-10 years' time and we have created a model for sustainable development that is actually relevant globally and not just in the UK.
Very positive, thank you.
Yeah, totally agree. I think we can be much more than what we are now. We are already a collective of public sector, private sector and communities doing something in an innovative way, and hopefully it doesn't matter what's our name in the future or what the policy exactly looks like, but we are an example of how place-based initiatives can work in collaboration, be an example to the world of developing solutions for challenges like decarbonization, green energy, and so much more. So hopefully, as Steve said, I think there is a future in which we can be an example of place-based innovation and place-based local development to other places as well.
Thank you.
For me, Freeports are acres, and you look after them, you get behind them, you support them, you cultivate them, and they become oak trees, or you don't, and unfortunately they wither and die. And for me, the most important thing is it's time to stop the politicising of Freeports and get behind them and push them forward. And equally, look at some of the other policies we've got in the UK and think, well, how can we align them better with these place-based policies? So things like GB Energy should utilise the Freeport network. The Department for Business and Trade has got some fantastic centres now to build upon and go out and sell much harder. So I think there needs to be this real cultivating process going on, and a recognition that Freeports are doing fantastic at the moment, but it will take time. We're talking about areas that have been left behind for tens and tens of years, and so we need a lot of time and love given to them in order to let them grow and flourish.
Thanks, Nolan. Well, that's a really positive aspect to finish up on. We've heard some tremendous sound bites today about how much energy there is in this Freeport sector and how the pillars have been put in place for business opportunities to really come to fruition. So I want to thank you all very much for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic. And of course, people will follow up with some questions for you after the event. Thank you.